Welcome to my presentation today on covenant. Thank you for joining me. Today we will be looking at a short story or illustration of covenant, and then we will explore some similarities and differences between covenant and transactions and contracts. Then we'll explore how covenant has to deal with organizations. And then we'll look at where does God fit into the whole question around covenant. I want to thank you once again for joining us. So I'd like to start by sharing with you a short story. Once upon a time, there was a land where there were blue dots and there were orange dots. And the blue dots bought and sold products and did business and made money. And the orange dots bought and sold products and made money, but they also cared about meaningful work and they cared about the environment. Over time, the orange dots and the blue dots realized that they could form bubbles. And if they formed a bubble of blue dots or a bubble of orange dots, they realized that they could do more business, that they could make more money, that they could be more profitable. But the orange dots also realized that within their orange bubble, that they could create meaningful work, more meaningful work, that they could have a greater impact and positive impact on the environment, that they could form a community. As time went on, and as the world got more complex, the people who ran a blue bubble realized that there were some skills that the orange dots had, and so they invited orange dot people or orange dots into their bubble. Conversely, the orange dots realized there were some tasks that were just better done as tasks, and so they invited some blue dots within their bubble. Then the world got more complicated, and the bubbles started to overlap. And so you had blue bubbles doing business with other blue bubbles, and blue bubbles doing business with orange bubbles, and orange bubbles doing business with blue bubbles. Then, as time went on, you started to see dark blue dots, and then you started to see light blue dots. But the interesting thing is you never saw the orange dots change color or become darker or lighter. But then something else happened. The blue dots started rubbing off on some of the orange dots, and blue dots turned orange. And conversely, some of the orange dots started becoming blue because of the blue dots rubbing off on the orange. Then, as time progressed, some of the orange bubbles realized that, it's difficult to always be focused on creating meaningful work, caring for the environment, as well as making profit. And they looked at their blue bubbles and said, the blue bubbles are very successful and they don't worry about those things. And so all of a sudden, the orange bubbles became blue bubbles. Sometimes this also happened because somebody who was a blue dot within the orange bubble developed a very strong narrative around budget as opposed to around stewardship. Or they developed a very strong narrative around numbers as opposed to the caring for people. And that rubbed off on the organization or the bubble, and the orange bubble became blue. But what happens is when an orange bubble becomes blue is that over time, the orange dots working within that bubble also become blue. And now we have that the world was slowly becoming more and more blue dots and blue bubbles. Then one day, there were two baby dots, a baby orange dot and a baby blue dot playing together. And they looked at each other one day and said, why are there orange dots and why are there blue dots? Well, they both decided to run home and ask their daddies, why are there orange dots and why are there blue dots? Well, the blue dot, when he asked his daddy, a big blue dot, daddy blue dot said, there are blue dots because that's the way business is done. It's the right way to do business, and there shall only ever be blue dots. The orange dot's daddy gave a very different answer. The orange dot's daddy said, there are orange dots and blue dots because there is a creator. And the creator created this world that we live in and gave people free choice to be orange dots or blue dots. But then the orange dot asked his daddy a strange question. But then why are there more blue dots than orange dots in the world? Gobstopped or gobsmacked, the orange daddy didn't have an answer. And the little baby orange dot did what little babies do, and he ran outside to play with his blue dot friend. I would suggest to you that this story about orange dots and blue dots is actually the story about transactions and covenants. And blue dots and blue bubbles are organizations and individuals that work from a transaction or a contract mindset. Whereas orange dots and orange bubbles are people and organizations that work from a covenant mindset. But does this conversation really matter? Does it really matter to talk about covenant? Many people with successful careers, they run successful businesses. They have very lucrative business ventures. They make lots of money by conducting business through transactions and contracts. So does it really matter? Or maybe it does. Let's think about this for a moment. Are we just here at work today to exchange a day's pay for a day's work? Or to borrow the words from Seth Godin in his book Linchpin, are we really willing to sell ourselves so cheaply? Are we just mortgaging an irreplaceable day of our life just for a few bucks? Is that all there is? Is the transaction over? For even at the end of the day, as the formula says, that work owes us nothing, and we owe our employer nothing in return. There's no bond, no ongoing connection between us as employees and our employer. We're just day laborers, and our employer, just our day boss. Is that really all there is? It's a very successful formula. Lots of businesses run this way. They make lots of money. And if that's all there is, this whole conversation on covenant really doesn't matter. But maybe, just maybe, this conversation is important. Maybe there is more to work than just exchanging a few bucks and have a few bucks for a few hours of pay. Maybe there's more to work than just having a few bucks deposited in your bank account at the end of every day. I would suggest that a day's work is a chance to do art, to create. It's a gift to do something that matters. It's an opportunity to love and an opportunity to be loved. It's an opportunity to form other people and to be formed by other people in community. Work is an opportunity to be transformed into Christ's image. And this isn't only a possibility, it's a present reality when we work from covenant mindset. So let's take a moment and define a few terms here. First of all, what is a moral contest? A moral contest is a competition between two parties. It's about political correctness. It's about me imposing my views on you. It's about me opposing my agenda on another party. Moral contests involve backstabbing, lobbing grenades. It's about I'm right and you're going to do things my way. A transaction, on the other hand, is a little bit different than that. A transaction is purely an exchange or interchange between two parties. Usually it's of a short duration. Let's say, for example, I need to find a plumber to fix a leaking tap. A transaction would be me going to Google, typing in plumber in Google, getting a list of plumbers, going down the list of plumbers and going, ABC Plumbing, that looks like a good name. They're number 3 in the Google search. They've got 5-star rating. I pick up my phone. I phone them. I make an appointment. They send somebody out to my house. He fixes my leaky tap. He leaves. We never get to know each other. It's in and out. It's a transaction. 6 months later, my hot water heater breaks. I go back to Google, type in plumber, and decide to call XYZ Plumbing. XYZ Plumbing goes, sorry, sir, can't come for 3 days to fix your hot water heater. Hang up, pick up the phone, Jack's Plumbing. Jack's Plumbing comes and says, sorry, can't fix your water heater for 2 weeks, too busy. Hang up. And then I scratch my head and try to remember, who did I call 6 months ago to fix my broken tap? Oh, that was ABC Plumbing. I phoned ABC Plumbing. They say they can come that afternoon. I say, great, come fix my water heater. They send somebody else, so it's a different person who came out last time. It's still a transaction. I just bought or sold a service. There's no relationship, there's no community, there's no care for the individual. A contract is similar to a transaction, except it's of a longer duration and there's a legally binding agreement. Think of the paper that you signed when you signed your mortgage. That's a contract. It has terms and conditions and penalties if you paid a mortgage out early. Or it's your employment contract, or it's a real estate contract. Contracts are legally binding agreements. So how do contracts and transactions differ from covenant? I would suggest that the major difference is that a covenant establishes boundaries and extends grace while waiting for a gratuitous response that may or may not come. There are 3 important words here. It establishes a boundary, it extends grace, and it waits for a gratuitous response that may or may not come. Covenant embraces and encompasses both transactions and contracts. Covenant focuses on the dignity of the individuals and their unique identity. Covenant is life lived in community. And I want to highlight two words here. The first phrase establishes boundaries. A covenant is not you being nice to somebody else. An example of that is if you rent an apartment from a room from a friend, and this friend of yours doesn't take care of it. And you go, well, but she's a single lady. She doesn't have any good technical skills, handyman skills. She doesn't have a lot of money. You're renting this room or this apartment from her to do her a favor. That's not a covenant, because in a covenant relationship, even though this lady is not taking good care of the place, you would allow this lady who you're renting from to not take care of the good place. You would be concerned about forming her character and helping her develop good skills and good habits. That even though she may not be able to afford a lot, extending grace is not allowing somebody to be sloppy. It's not allowing somebody to do poor workmanship. Extending grace and establishing boundaries still expects quality. It still expects profit to be made. But it's done as a sense to see the person develop as an individual. So in this example of renting an apartment from a friend who is not taking care of it, this becomes a covenantal relationship only when both parties hold each other accountable and help each other to be accountable as a good tenant and as a good landlord. Tim Keller defined covenant this way. He said, a covenant is a relationship that is more loving and intimate than a merely legal relationship. Yet it's more binding and durable and accountable than a merely personal relationship. Covenant is a stunning blend of law and love. It's stunning because it's a personal relationship, made more loving and intimate because it's legal, through voluntary, mutual binding promises. It's made with vows to be loving and to be faithful, no matter what the circumstances. So what are some differences between a covenant and a contract or a transaction? Contracts and transactions are often based on pride and rigidity. This is the way it is. A covenant is based around humility and flexibility. And with humility, there's repentance, there's forgiveness in a covenant. In a contract, there are terms and conditions, penalties and judgment when mistakes are made. In a covenant, there's promises, there's presence, there's partnership. In a contract, people give answers, and the best answer wins. In a covenant, people are formed in community. They're free to ask questions. They're free to learn together. Contracts are based around budgets and a scarcity of resources that have to be rationed and optimized. Covenant looks at the world differently. It says there's an abundance of resources, and the limitations of resources is a boundary given to the organization or to an individual to be creative within and to be wise stewards within. Within contracts or transactions, doors are usually closed. Within a covenant, doors are usually open. Within a covenant, people are accepted for what they have to offer, and when they have nothing else to offer, they're thrown away like expendable crew members. They're disposable pawns in the chessboard. In a covenant, people seek to understand and to be understood. Boundaries are established, and you wait for a gratuitous response that may or may not come. Contracts are all about talking, whereas covenants are about listening. Contracts are emotionless at best, and at worst are preoccupied by fear, whereas a covenant is based on love. There's some caveats about covenants that I want you to think about. As human beings, we are limited to how many people we can relate to and extend grace to. I can't extend grace and relate to, in a deep way to 1 million people, or even to 100 people. I just don't have that capacity. I can only extend covenant and enter into covenantal relationships with a handful of people. Therefore, the best we can do is to strive for living by the principles of covenant. But a different caveat here as well is to realize that sometimes we make decisions from both a covenant and a transaction mindset. For example, when I just recently started a new job as a professor of business at the Leader School of Business at King's University. And as I was processing whether or not to accept this job offer, there were two thoughts that went through my mind. My mind went down to covenant mindset. What would it look like for me to enter into a community of other like-minded Christians? What would it look like to be in a community where I would be formed as a better professor and would grow in my Christian faith, and would have an opportunity to grow kings and grow to men and women who are faculty there as well? Or as Solomon says, as iron sharpens iron, one person sharpens another person. But then I thought back to my career and said, is this a reality? What if this isn't a reality from my experience at King's? Would I still take this job? And so I slid from a covenant mindset over into a transaction mindset and said, what's in this for me? And I realized that what's in it for me is an opportunity to develop my teaching skills. It's an opportunity to have time to research topics that are of interest to me and to be paid to write papers on topics that are of interest to me. And so there was a transactional mindset that went into this job decision. And so I made my decision to become a professor at King's at the Leader School of Business, both from a covenant mindset and from a transaction mindset. Now, one of the things to understand as you think about transactions and covenants are masks. And in a world of transactions, in a world of contracts, it is safe to hide behind a mask. In fact, it's probably even safer to be hiding behind a mask in a world of transactions and contracts, because there's a way to protect yourself emotionally. They're a way to hide who you are, but they're also a way to have a shell around you. In general, transactions are not concerned about people being known or people being shaped. And so you can hide behind the mask. And so we protect ourselves in transactions, covenants with our mask. And as long as the future is advantageous to us, it is safer for our survival to hide behind a mask. But covenant says this is a safe space. It's a place where you can be known and maybe just peel a little bit of your mask off and let people get to see the real you. What motivates you? What makes your heart beat? What makes you get up in the morning? What are your hopes and dreams? That is what covenant is about. It's a safe place where people can get a glimpse of who you truly are. But what about covenants and organizations? What does it look like for an organization or an orange bubble to reflect the principles of covenant? I would suggest that for an organization that wants to reflect the principles of covenant, their values are around the people who are their customers, the people who are their suppliers, the people who are their shareholders. Yes, it absolutely is about money, because you cannot reach people without money. But the driver is about people, not primarily about money. The language of an organization that focuses on transaction and contracts is around budget. It's around strategic planning. It's around training. And but a covenant or organization, an organization that values covenant, says budget, strategic planning, training, performance management are tools that we use to be stewards of the resources that we have, to strategically discern the future of the organization. They're tools that we use for the formation of our staff. And a covenant organization goes beyond performance management to explore grace and forgiveness with customers, with suppliers, with employees. They focus on meaningful work and creation care. Shalom and harmony become themes and language that the organization talks about. They talk about inclusivity, hope. They're an organization that focuses on safety. They are orange bubbles. The challenge in the orange bubble organization and an organization that focuses on a covenant mindset is that when the language becomes budgets and strategic plannings, the organization drifts from covenant to transaction. And yet you ask the question, there are parts of every organization that are pure tasks. The person has to come in and fix the furniture or install furniture, fix the heating. Is there a way to view that job purely from a covenantal perspective? Our church that I was attending was doing a building program, and we needed a security guard because there were no doors on the building for a season. Do we view this security guard? We had this conversation as an elders board. Is this security guard who's sitting in our sanctuary every evening and overnight just a security guard? Does somebody we hired for a task to keep the church secure? Or was this security guard hired as somebody who God brought into this building for a season, with whom we could enter, who had stories and hopes and dreams that we as a church could come to know, and maybe in some way help him or her fulfill those dreams? Was this a transaction, having a security guard guarding the church, or was this a covenantal relationship? But interesting though, so, and conversely, an orange bubble, these are the blue dots that are working in an orange bubble. But the interesting thing is, and even with an example of the security guard in the church, is that a covenant will not impose itself on its people. Well, we as a church might strive to get to know the security guard for who he is as a person and his hopes and dreams. We would extend grace to this person. It's an extension of grace without expecting a gracious response in return. But what about the flip side of that? What about orange dots and blue bubbles? Is it possible that somebody with a covenant mindset can flourish in an organization with a transactional mindset? Let me share a story with you. Two stories, in fact. One of the organizations that I worked with on contract had a very strong transactional contract mindset with everything that he did within their department. Everything was around metrics and numbers and performance. And this was a software project. The amount of code that was being written every day, the number of lines of code. There were 20 different graphs that were being reported every day, measuring different performance factors. And I was brought in there as an expert in my field, but I ended up not spending a lot of time as an expert in my field, but listening to people's stories. And by listening to people's stories, I was able to encourage them. It was known that when I was coming in, when I was on the floor in that company, there was laughter ringing throughout that floor. That's what a covenant person does when they enter into an organization that's based on transactions. I worked in another organization, and it was ruled by fear. And I went out of my way to create a canopy of grace for the people in my department, that they would be protected under this bubble from the fear that was going on around them. Now, somebody pointed out to me, there were holes in this canopy. There were still times when fear poked itself through. There were times when I became afraid. But in the middle of all of that, in general, this was a department that was marked by laughter. There was peace in this department. Our productivity happened because we enjoyed working with each other. We wanted to see each other become better people, become better in their technical skills. And it was in this mindset of grace that we tried to work together as best we could. As I mentioned before, when we looked at this graph, when we looked at this chart, that organizations can shift from a covenant to a transaction mindset when the dominant narrative becomes around things around budget and strategic planning and training. And when that happens, those people who are orange dots in the blue bubble organization, their hearts are broken. But there are also times when there are just some people that are just easier to love than others. And we all love them perfectly. But the thing that happens in an organization that values covenant, when a transaction occurs, it's like launching a grenade. And the shrapnel from that grenade hurts more than the people who were hurt in that transaction, but all the people in the organization. And those people at the organization start building scar tissue. And eventually the scar tissue becomes so thick that it becomes hard to love. It becomes hard to still remain in a covenant mindset. And it just becomes easier for everything just to become transactions. And the challenge is when an organization is dominated by transactional narratives of budgets, of strategic plans, of metrics. How many numbers have we? The numbers drive every decision. As opposed to the stories of transformed lives, as opposed to the stories of customers, of people who have been formed. It becomes very hard to drive a stake in the ground and say no more conversations around budgets, we are now going to have a conversation around transformed lives. We're going to go back to the things that were important to us originally and have conversations around that. But that's a very hard transition to make. And covenants can be hard. It's hard to extend grace. It's hard to extend grace to that person who is tone deaf and lobs a grenade within the organization through some transactional mode. But let me caution you for a moment. Maybe this person is unskilled in applying the principles of covenant in one area of their life or job. Maybe they were never trained. For example, how do you extend grace to someone who thinks they're a collaborative negotiator and is clueless that they're coming across as a hard-nosed jerk, if you want to use that word? This describes me. I thought when I was working in one of my organizations, I was negotiating contracts for construction and communication equipment for a new office tower, that I was being very collaborative. I spent a lot of time with the suppliers. We did a lot of meals together. We spent time together on the golf course. I thought I was being collaborative. I found out afterwards that I was actually thought of as a very hard-nosed negotiator. And nobody had the courtesy to come to me and say, James, you're a hard-nosed negotiator. Here's a better way to do it. Before you throw stones at the person who is breaking the principles of covenant in your organization, do they have the skills to do this? Or think about the person who doesn't know how to give good feedback, or has been tasked to do a layoff, and they've never done a layoff before in their career, and they do it poorly. Do you have a right to throw stones at them? Or could you come alongside them and extend them grace and show them a better way? Living by covenant is a skill that has to be learned for different situations. Do we extend grace to the team leader who is wonderful as caring for customers, but doesn't know how to give feedback to their team? Or do we chop them off at their knees? But as you listen to this conversation, I left someone out of this conversation. I left God out of this conversation. And when you leave God out of the conversation on covenant, a covenant will always become a contract. And contracts will degenerate to transactions, and these will degenerate to moral contests. Without God, I would argue that it is impossible for an organization or an individual to maintain a covenant mindset. And let me share with you two examples. The first example comes from medicine. 60 years ago, the family doctor took care of the whole patient. The family doctor knew the patient's story. The family doctor probably lived close to the patient. They knew the patient's family. They were there when their children were born. They were there when their children got married. They understood. They knew where the patient worked. They knew the patient's life story. And if the patient had health issues, they also knew the life issues that were happening to the patient. And this was very rewarding for the physician to watch this patient grow and mature in their career and to take care of their health issues. But there was a problem with this health care. The patient had a heart attack. The family physician didn't have the skills to necessarily revive the patient when they had a heart attack. And so medicine started specializing. And medicine started shifting from covenant to contract, where the family doctor, when the patient had a heart attack, would send the patient off to a heart specialist. But initially, the patient would have a long-term contract with the heart specialist. He would do the open heart surgery or put in the stents. But then the heart specialist would continue to see this patient over time and continue to treat the heart issue, the problems with that patient's heart. But this turned out to not be very efficient. And so in the interest of efficiency, medicine moved more toward a transaction treating of patients with heart attacks or any other medical procedure. And soon it became, if a patient had a heart attack, one doctor saw them in emergency. Another doctor would see them in the cardiac care ward. A third doctor would cut them open for a coronary bypass surgery. A fourth doctor would do the coronary bypass. The third doctor might stitch them together. But Doctor 3 and 4 may never talk to the patient because the patient is always unconscious, sedated for the surgery. It was purely a transaction. For the physician, the heart surgeon, it was another patient to cut open, another heart, another 4 valves to rearrange in the patient's heart, and another another piece of meat to sew together. Medicine had lost the joy and value of practicing medicine. Medicine was no longer covenant. In the same way was business. Think back to business 50, 60 years ago, where an organization cared about the supplier and cared about the employees and cared about the customers and entered into long-term relationships. Where organizations said we thrive and rise on the success and failure of our supplier. We rise and succeed on the success and failure of our customers. But then somebody pointed out, as a business, if you did a tender or a request for proposal for suppliers, you could get to your products and services at a cheaper price. And so that's what businesses did. And so then they entered into long-term contracts as opposed to long-term relationships. Who could supply the product for the lowest price? And then instead of a 5-year contract, what about a 6-month contract? And instead of having inventory on hand, just-in-time inventory, just enough to make the product. It's more efficient. It's more cost-effective. It drives higher profit. It's a much better way of doing business. Or is it? Look at the progress of medicine. Look at the progress of business. There are things that medicine can do today that could never have been done under the covenant model of medicine, where the family doctor took care of the patient from cradle to grave. So covenant doesn't matter. It's a waste of time. Business is much more profitable today through transactions, in a series of transactions, and getting the lowest price, and squeezing suppliers and squeezing customers. That's far more profitable. It's a waste of time. This whole conversation, contracts, transactions, is the way to go. It's the way to make money. It's the way for better health care. You and I are living longer because medicine is based on transactions today. Or have I wasted your time? Are contracts and covenants actually short-sighted? Think about that for a moment. When we ignore people's feelings, hopes, dreams, desires, is that short-sighted? Maybe. Does it matter to the heart surgeon when he's performing coronary bypass what the hopes and dreams and desires of that patient lying on the operating table really are? At that moment? Maybe not. Maybe contracts are the way to go. But can you have transactions or contracts without people? So where does God fit into this conversation? Let's take a look for a moment at the Abrahamic covenant. In the Old Testament, God establishes a covenant with Abraham, and God defines the terms of the covenant. But what's interesting, when God establishes his covenant with Abraham, God also says that he will pay the penalty if Abraham breaks the covenant, or if any of Abraham's descendants will break the covenant. And the day comes when God sends his son, Jesus, and Jesus dies on the cross and rises again. And that is the penalty that God pays so that you and I can be in covenant with God. Now, you might say that God's invitation to enter into covenant with him isn't real because you've seen the way people behave in the church. You've seen the way church leaders behave. You've read the stories of women who've been abused by Christian leaders. I would actually argue to you that that proves that entering into a covenant relationship with God is actually valuable. Because remember my definition of covenant. It's extending grace when grace is never returned. By God extending grace to these Christian leaders who may not act in a covenant way for one reason or another, God is demonstrating that he will extend grace to you and I when we fail, when we make mistakes. And that gives me great hope. And that is why it is valuable to enter into a covenant relationship with God. But let's think some more. I would suggest that a lasting covenant can only be made in God's presence. And when we make our covenants in God's presence, we are being a witness to the world that God is present in everyday life, that God is present in every conversation, that God is present in every moment of life. A covenant is a testimony that God is fundamental to human flourishing. A covenant is a testimony that Jesus is Lord over all aspects of life. But a covenant with God is not a promise of life without struggles, temptations, failures, bullies, inquisitors, pandemics, doubts, fears, heartache, and pain. Don't let anybody feed you that lie that if you enter in a covenant relationship with God, that you won't have struggles or failures. We live in a fallen and a broken world. But covenant gives us a path forward. Yes, even when we have God at the center of every covenant relationship, somebody in the relationship will break our heart. There will be failures. There will be heartache. Sooner or later, one of the parties in a covenant relationship will get hurt. David wrote these words in Psalm 55:13 when he experienced this. If an enemy were insulting me, I could endure it. If a foe were rising against me, I could hide. But it is you, a man like myself, my companion, my close friend, one whom I once enjoyed sweet fellowship at the house of God as we walked about among the worshipers. It was this person who had broken David's heart, who had not returned grace to David when David had returned grace, extended grace to him. This is the reality of covenant. This will happen. Let me show you an example. The servant is not greater than the master. Jesus said these words. Think about Jesus for just one moment. And when you think about Jesus, don't shake your fist at God when somebody breaks a covenant, when somebody doesn't extend grace back to you when you extend grace to them. Think about Jesus before we go here. Think about Jesus at the Last Supper, the night before he's betrayed. Being fully God, he knows what's going to happen the next day. He knows that one of those 12 is going to betray him. He knows that Peter is going to deny him. He knows that all 12 are going to walk away and desert him the next day. And yet, what does he do? He extends grace. He eats a meal with them. He washes their feet. He prays for them. He reminds them that they can have joy and hope and peace, and that he is coming back again. He leaves them with hope, even though he knows the next day they will desert him. And do you know why Jesus is able to do this? There's a little verse at the beginning of John chapter 13, which talks about Jesus knowing who he is and knowing where he's going. It is the fact that we know whose we are, that we are God's beloved children. It's the fact that we know that we have the hope of heaven that enables us to choose to say we will enter into covenant relationships in our business and in our lives. And it's when we make that choice that we know God promises us that we will have the blessing of God in our life. It's not a blessing that says life will be without problems. It's a blessing on our life. When we make the choice to live by covenant, we're making the choice to see God be glorified, just as God was glorified through the death and resurrection of his Son. It's a choice to walk with the Holy Spirit moment by moment and day by day, to know the joy and the glory of having God's Holy Spirit walking with us. When we choose to live by covenant, we know that we are loved by the Father. And it is that love that overflows from us that enables us to extend grace to others. We don't have enough love in ourselves. Not a chance to extend grace without expecting grace in return. But being loved by God the Father, that enables us to extend love to others. It knows that we are kept by Jesus. When that person, when that organization launches a grenade and that shrapnel hits us, it doesn't destroy us. It hurts us, absolutely. But it doesn't destroy us because we are kept by Jesus. We are known that we are friends of God. When that friend, that person who we thought is a friend, fails to extend grace, and knowingly or unknowingly stabs us in the back and robs our dreams of us, and takes them and makes them his own, and breaks our heart, we know that we are still God's friend. And she cannot, when she does that, separate us from God's love. She cannot remove God's friendship from us when they violate the covenant relationship that we thought we had enjoyed with them. And God protects our heart. We don't need to hide behind a mask. We don't need to build a thick shell, for we have God who protects us. And we know great joy, even in the middle of the pain. And part of this joy is the experience of God's angels comforting us when our heart is broken. These angels that comfort us when our heart is broken may be a brother or sister in Christ who wraps his arms around us and holds us tight and whispers a word of prayer for us then and there. This is how you show to your brother and sister that you're in a covenant relationship. Not, I'll pray for you tomorrow, but you put your hands on my shoulder and you say, I'll pray for you now. And then we have the privilege of watching God act. We don't have to reciprocate. We have the confidence that God will deal with our cares. David says, cast your cares on the Lord and he will sustain you. He will never let the righteous be shaken. This is David's words after his friend, his close brother, had hurt him. He says, but the Lord will not let the righteous be shaken. I can cast my cares on the Lord. We, as followers of Christ, and we choose to live by covenant, when we live in a covenant relationship with God, have the privilege of watching God act when someone doesn't reciprocate. We may not see God act the way we want him to act. In fact, we probably won't. We won't see God sending an angel to us to take his wing and scratch the side of this person's car. We won't see God send an angel when this person is flying on their vacation to crash into their airplane and have the airplane crash into the ground and kill them. That's not God's way. God will extend grace to this person. And it'll be up to that person to receive or reject God's offer of grace. That's beyond our control. We will see God extend grace to that person, and we can rejoice that God will deal with this person. And so today I invite you, I leave you with a choice. Will you be a blue dot person? Will your life be marked by transactions? Or will you be an orange dot person? Will your organization be an orange bubble organization where the dominant narrative is around stewardship, where the dominant narrative is around strategic discernment, where your dominant narrative is around stories of forming and shaping people? And if you're find yourself working today in an organization where the dominant narrative has shifted to being transactions and budgets and numbers and pie charts and graphs, I invite you to connect with 2 or 3 other people and start telling a different narrative. Start telling the stories of people who are being formed. Sit together and start praying together for each other, for the customers that you serve. Don't let the dominant narrative of transaction destroy your organization. But do this through the power of God. Don't do this on your own strength. You will fail. Do not leave God out of your covenant relationships. You cannot build a covenant successfully without building upon God. So I'd like to thank you for being here with me tonight as I shared with you a little bit about the difference between covenant and contract. If you'd like to learn more about this topic, please contact me and we can explore this topic further. Thank you.